Hi, we enter into 2 Samuel 22 today, the first of two Psalms supposedly written by David here and that put in the center of the chiasm that frames chapter 21 to 24. And today, and as we go through the Psalm, is a great example of the importance of the interpretive tool of narrative context, to read the story in its place in the larger context. Because if we were to read this psalm just on its own, we get one impression of David and of Yahweh, but when we read it not only in the context of this immediate closure here, surrounded by the stories of violence and the celebration of killers, and the larger story of David, and the larger story of the monarchy, we might hear it a very different way. And so that's what we'll do. As I've been noting all along, the language of the psalm in chapter 22 is one of the great examples of the evidence for which we can conclude that this story is from much later, and this whole section is from much later. Here's a chart I showed in the introduction of this unit, and if you haven't watched that introduction, I'd encourage you to do so, where I go over some of this in more detail. And you can see how many words, and this is not all of them, this is only some of them. I didn't want to make this overly long, of words that are either unique or rare in the entire Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, but also rare in the Deuteronomistic history, all the way from Deuteronomy, which is in both these sections here, the end of Torah and the beginning of the Deuteronomistic history, all the way through 2 Kings. So that's Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And these are the only places these words in this chapter are found elsewhere in the DH. But also, just as an indicator, I've noted how many times they're in the Psalms in comparison with how many times they are overall in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew. I could also compare it to things like Proverbs, which is also a late text, but since this is a psalm, I thought it would be fitting to show how the language is psalmic. And as you can see, given the Psalms are only one book of the Bible, how concentrated this language is in psalmic language. Not always in the intensive way, but notice 20 out of 24 times, 25 out of 37 times, 20 out of 36, 89 out of 144, etc. And so this is psalm language. And one of the questions anybody who is asking about David's relationship is, how would David know this language, which exists in Hebrew that's several hundred years after the fact? And the bottom line is, he couldn't have. We can't answer the question here whether David wrote any Psalms. We certainly know that one of the reasons why David is attributed as the author of the Psalms is a similar reason why Solomon is attributed as the author of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and the non-canonical book Wisdom of Solomon, because that gives them a provenance connected with somebody who's an important authority figure. In other words, they didn't understand it as some modern Christians do, as inspired, as Yahweh wrote it, but it was written by somebody within the Israelite Judite world that had authority. So the traditional understanding is that Moses wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy, and that David wrote the Psalms, etc. Modern scholarship realizes that's silly for all kinds of reasons, especially the one I just noted. This is language that David could not have known. So unless you want to engage in the kind of magical thinking that even some fundamentalist Christians do, that God can make people do things they weren't otherwise capable of doing, then we have to recognize that this is being put in the mouth of David by a much later author. But it's also being put there in this larger context. And we can't say whether the people who editorially arranged this way wrote all these pieces. They're very different genres, as we've been seeing. Chapter 21 and the story at the end of chapter 24 are narratives. Then we saw two lists modified by a few little other things along the way in addition to the lists. And then we have Psalms. So certainly one person is capable of writing all those different kind of things. I write emails and books, and sometimes I write poems and short stories, and maybe you can write all kinds of different things too. So just the fact that there are different genres doesn't tell us anything about authorship. But we know from the psalm that it's late, and we don't know from the others that are late. So somebody put all this together. And by doing that, they put this psalm right after a list of people who are being celebrated for being killers, and ahead of another list that's nothing but killing. As I noted in the last video, 30 people who were celebrated for nothing other than how many people they killed, without even giving a context for it. He killed 2 sons of so-and-so, he killed an Egyptian, but no sense that there's war or defense of David or defense of the land or anything, just that they were killing machines. So we have to put that celebration of violence in general and of supposedly of violence that Yahweh approved of in David's life in relation to what we hear in this psalm and in relation to what we hear throughout the rest of the these books and throughout the rest of the Bible, which is to say, in the context of the larger argument in the entire scriptural collection between what I call the religion of empire and the religion of creation. So let's look at a couple other elements of the narrative context. And first, let's look at the way the psalm is structured. We see two chiasms in the middle. And note, I have 3 Roman numerals. This is based on Falkman's breaking it into 3 chunks. And we'll look at it that way, but just let's note the basic plot. So it starts off in the first person voice, and we're told in the introit at the beginning, as David speaking this, that it's a person in great distress, an individual. And we'll contrast this, as we'll see, with Deuteronomy 32, which is Moses addressing the people as a whole. So this is an individual who's in deep trouble, but we don't see exactly why. It's symbolic, waves of death and torrents of Belial, cords of Sheol. And then calls upon Yahweh in that distress, and Yahweh almost literally breaks open heaven and earth to get down to save this person. And we'll look at this chiastic element here, which shows God as the storm king, among other things, perhaps like Baal, but totally in charge of the sky and the foundations of the earth, reaching down from on high to pull out this person who cried out. And then it continues by suggesting this happened according to the speaker David's righteousness and cleanness of his hands. So David is describing himself here, to the extent that we take this as the voice of David, if not the authorship of David, as Mr. Perfect. I have kept the ways of Yahweh, have not become a criminal before my God. From his statutes I did not turn away. I was complete before him, kept myself from guilt. Really? Okay, so that's the basis by which he claims that Yahweh has reached down out of the sky to save him. And then there's a general statement that this is how God works. God saves people who are devout and pure and lowly and are saved. And then it goes on to say why Yahweh has saved David: to make him a good warrior. He trains my hands for war so my arms can bend a bow, giving me the shield of your salvation. Notice this is not like Paul in Ephesians, where he uses armor as a spiritual symbol, as a spiritual warfare without any offensive weapons. But here plainly there are offensive weapons. There are arrows, etc. And he describes himself as empowered by Yahweh to beat people like the dust of the earth, to crush them and stamp them down like the mire of the streets. And then it ends with a celebration of God who provides vengeance to people. And then David sings their praises of a God who shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever, highlighting the Davidic monarchy. So the fairest way to describe this is a work of political propaganda, and yet it's placed within texts that undermine its very premise. And so we'll have to look at why this is put there, and we can certainly expect that readers would see it in this context and wonder about that. Let's look at a few other things about it. Note the nature imagery in several categories. It's much about water. As my note down below on the left from Clement says, the theme is the victory of Yahweh over the power of the water of the sea. He's taking that as a description of the entire psalm. That's part of it, but it's not all of it. But we see all these images of water, all these different images of fire and smoke, images of light and dark, images of the sky, and images of rock and mountains and earth. And yet, it's not quite the creator. As I was noting, it's much more the storm god. It's not, it says explicitly that God made all these things, but that God has power over all these things. And we'll see more of that, especially next time, as you can see on the left side, with the beginning of that chiastic unit. The earth reeled and rocked, and the foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because of God's anger. Now, to expand the narrative context, we need to see how this psalm here at the end of the books of Samuel connects both with Hannah's song at the beginning and David's song of the bow in the middle. So let's look just briefly at some of those connections, and you can see the purple elements here are those that are from Psalm 20 or 2 Samuel 22, Psalm 18, that are also in Hannah's song. So this image about the horn we saw on the left side, you can even see it now, the horn of my salvation. Here, my horn is exalted, and we'll talk about horn when we get back to chapter 22. My mouth derides my enemies, no rock like my God, and we see my rock, all over chapter 22. The bows of the mighty are broken, the feeble gird on strength. He brings down to Sheol and raises up, brings low and exalts, and we saw that. Raises the poor from the dust. The pillars of the earth are Yahweh's. He will guard the feet of his faithful, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. Will thunder from heaven and will give strength to his king, exalt the power of his anointed. And that's the bottom line that connects it explicitly, because, of course, this was a song of a woman who was perceived as drunk by the local priest Eli, whose son Samuel is the one who will make this whole story go. and will, of course, anoint Saul to be the first king in Yahweh's name. Let's look at the song in the middle here. This is the one that David sang over the dead bodies of Jonathan and Saul, whose bones were just brought together and buried properly in chapter 21 in the beginning of this unit. So here in the black, you can see some of the language that's from chapter 22 that are back here in chapter 1. The mighty have fallen, which is a refrain throughout this, and the very name Song of the Bow, Keshes, is only in chapter 22, elsewhere in 2 Samuel. The same with the shield, the Magen. The Magen David is 3 times in our psalm and only elsewhere. And then the issue of being distressed is only in chapter 24, not quite in the psalm, but in this unit. So many connections there. And there's one more. To highlight that this is written late, at least as late as Deuteronomy and Joshua, which would be roughly the time of Josiah in the 630s, we can see some of the connections here between the psalm that's within Moses' speech in Deuteronomy 32. And it's a very different context. What's being spoken here in Deuteronomy 32 is the memory of a God who drew the people out of Egypt, even though the people were resistant throughout the entire way, and yet God was faithful. So it describes how God guided them, took them atop the land, gave them food, and yet they made him jealous with other gods, sacrificed to demons, and made God jealous and kindled his anger, and yet came back around eventually. And so you can see the purple elements here are the elements that are in 2 Samuel 22 noted here, and also in Deuteronomy. And many of those are among the rare words, like the crags here, and the word for speech. Speech, obviously, is on every page, but the word for speech, as we see from the late words chart, is rare here as well. And we see a number of those here. So connecting both the summary of Moses' life at the end as he sends them out into the promised land, and David's as he sends the people out symbolically into the ongoing dynasty of David immediately under the reign of Solomon. And in many ways, that could make sense out of the larger narrative, the post-exilic sense of the Bible, because the authors of Chronicles, who rewrote the books of Samuel to take out all the exciting parts, all the sexy parts and the violent parts, and to make it just as if David's purpose in being king was to establish the temple in Jerusalem. And so it starts from that sense that God's creation is the beginning. Chronicles starts with Genesis 1, having been written obviously after that, and includes at least a brief reference to some sense of an exodus, and then goes to the temple. So the idea that the scriptural narrative from Genesis through at least through 2 Kings is there's creation, there's exodus, there's monarchy, there's a temple, and there's exile. And we can see that built into these sections here. So let's put the shape back up. I won't go over all the words in detail because this chart here has the various words and where they're located, so there's no point in reproducing that. Let's just look at the nature of it and what it's saying theologically as we see this up here. So the first thing to note, once we've heard this introduction here, is when is at least the story world of the psalm supposed to be taking place. It says, when Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So delivering from the hand of his enemies could mean just at the end of the situation that happened in the book of 2 Samuel after the Absalom rebellion and the post-Absalom rebellions that we also looked at in chapters 19 and 20. But the hand of Saul is obviously way earlier. He was delivered from the hand of Saul at the end of the first book, and hence the Song of the Bow, which wasn't celebrating being delivered. It was celebrating ostensibly how wonderful Jonathan and Saul were in Yahweh's eyes according to the mouth of David. So after that, then we just hear a series of nouns. And it's interesting because many commentators in the Psalms note how much the Psalms are characterized by their interesting verbs, by they describe what God does and what people do. But here's simply a long list of nouns, and not surprisingly, there are 12 of them in the Hebrew. Let's just hear them, the litany of them. We'll look in more detail. Yahweh is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock, using a different term, my crag over here, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, my refuge, my Savior, and the one who saves me from violence. Wow, quite a lot of things. And we won't look at them all in detail, but the impression we get from all these is of strength. Horn of my salvation is a term that may seem strange to us in English, and horn, kerem, here is what was translated sometimes as mighty or as power. In Hannah's song here, I translated it up here as horn, where in New RSV it has something else there. I don't even remember what it had there, but horn is the right word there. So horn, like an animal horn, as you can see here, also like in a shofar when it's played as a trumpet, translated that way. But whether you think it's a goat horn or some other horn is understood as a symbol of power. And so sometimes it's simply translated that way as a euphemism for power. So God is the power of my salvation. And my stronghold, like taking refuge, several examples of that. And of course, in David's lifetime, that was in caves and other things. He did not take refuge in God so much, he took refuges in caves. My Savior, and you saved me from violence. And David certainly was saved from violence. He wasn't saved from engaging in violence. One could simply say he just happened to come out alive, but you'd have to make that judgment for yourself. So after the long litany, we hear this: I call upon Yahweh, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. And then we hear it again in verse 7. It's not quite a chiasm here, but in my distress I called upon Yahweh. When did we ever hear that happen? And the fact of the matter is, from the time David is anointed king in 2 Samuel 5 until the last scene we saw in chapter 21, which is obviously outside the chronology of the actual narrative of David's life, he never once calls upon Yahweh. He calls upon his advisors, he calls upon his generals and other people, but he never once is said to turn to Yahweh. He talks about Yahweh, he suggests that Yahweh will take care of him, but never once do we see him do what is being said here, to call upon Yahweh. But Yahweh is certainly worthy to be praised, using the word mahula, from which we get hallelujah. And again, it's one of those words 89 times in the Psalms, not surprisingly. Saved from my enemies. And then we get these interesting images of water and death together. And if you're not familiar, I guess I didn't mention this, and we probably should, in going over a psalm, of the very nature of Hebrew poetry, to have these two-line parallelism. So one line matches another, usually sometimes with intensification, but simply with parallel. So we see waves of death, torrents of Belial, encompassed me, assailed me, entangled me, confronted me. It's not a fixed formula. Sometimes we see 3 lines for emphasis. Sometimes we'll see other forms of it, but that's the standard form that we see throughout. And so I've characterized it this way in the typography. So, worthy to be praised, saved from my enemies, waves of death encompass me. And it's an interesting thing of walls of water that embody death. The basic meaning here is really of breaking waves, but can also mean the mouth of the womb. It's only in Jonah outside the Psalms in here. Encompassed me. Are we supposed to be picturing a particular situation, being surrounded perhaps by Absalom's people, although he never really was surrounded by Absalom's people? I think if we try to take the poetic language and attach it too closely to the historical circumstances, we'll go wrong, because I don't think the authors, in whatever time they were writing this, had that exactly in mind. The torrents of perdition is translated here, but it's really Belial. And Belial is rarely used as an adjective this way or as a noun in this form. It usually refers to a group of people, the sons of Belial, often described in some euphemistic way in the New RSV. But here, the torrents of perdition, Belial simply refers to just badness in general. It's not exactly evil like the devil or Satan, but it is a generic Hebrew word for bad things. So torrents of perdition assailed me. Cords of Sheol entangled me. And those 4 different versions of this. Now they're no longer water, but cords of Sheol, whatever that could mean, to picture Sheol as a place underground, not like hell, but just simply underground where all dead people go, entangled me. So there's some sense perhaps of being pulled underground, that you're so close to death, you're being pulled into the earth. The snares of death, and again, bait or lure. So both of these in verse 6 seem to be imagery of being trapped or pulled down, as opposed to the images in verse 5 of being washed away. So in that horrible context, in my distress, using the word tsar here, the sense of being in a confined or restricted space, which seems to fit exactly the description in verse 5 and 6, I called upon Yahweh. To my God I called. from his temple, using the word Hekal here, which is interestingly not the word often used for a temple in 1 Kings. The word used for temple in 1 Kings is bayit, house. This is used sometimes, and you can see some examples of it in 1 Kings here. But it's also a connection back to 1 Samuel 3:3, which is just after Hannah's song in the first chapter, but also linked, if we go back to that, as we saw in the last scene with the lamp of God. So David's men told him when he got faint that he should not go out into battle with anymore, that the lamp of Israel would not be quenched. And so this referred back to the lamp of God, and we see the lamp of God not gone out while Samuel was lying in the Heshel of Yahweh. Plainly not the Jerusalem temple in either situation, which is not made yet. And we don't have to read it anachronistically as a Jerusalem temple, because, as I noted, the Jerusalem temple is usually not referred to that way. The word Hekal can also mean a palace, as like a king's palace, or in the ordinary secular sense of a wealthy person's house. So from that place, whether we assume that to be the place that Eli was ministering to in 1 Samuel or some other place, he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. And literally a cry for help. So out of that situation, we hear that David is expressing himself as someone who has no one to turn to but Yahweh, and was in this dire, desperate situation, cried out, and Yahweh came to his help. And we'll look next time at the incredible imagery that's described of what Yahweh will do to come rescue David. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.